I am Alice Delgado, 35 years old. On the day I signed the final papers to sell what should have been my house, my parents and brother sat across from me at the closing table, grinning like Franks, while I was treated like a stranger. The marble conference room reeked of expensive cologne and false smiles, and the pen in my hand felt heavier than a hammer striking my future. The house wasn't just property. It was the place where I grew up, where I first sketched out floor plans as a little girl, dreaming of becoming a real estate agent one day. Yet somehow, after years of sweat and sacrifice, it had been stolen from me by the very people I once trusted most. As the lawyer congratulated the family on securing the deal, I sat silent, my chest burning, while the walls closed in. The office windows overlooked downtown Miami, sun bouncing off the glass towers, but none of that light reached me. My brother, Dustin, leaned back smugly in his chair, twirling the keychain the buyers had gifted him, as if mocking me. My parents beamed with pride at him, ignoring the tears stinging my eyes. I wanted to scream, to rip up the papers, to tell the truth. But in that moment, I felt like the child I used to be, powerless and silenced. Before I share how this betrayal unfolded, let me know where you are watching from and subscribe if you value standing up for yourself. Growing up in Miami, our modest 2-story home on Coral Way was more than 4 walls and a roof. It was a fortress during hurricanes, a playground when money was tight, and a gallery for my endless childhood sketches of houses. I would sit by the window, drawing rooftops and front porches, telling Mom, "One day I'll sell houses like this for real." She'd smile faintly, though more often than not, she seemed tired from juggling shifts as a nurse. Dad was stricter, a construction worker whose words carried the weight of cement. He always said, "Property is power, Alice. Remember that." But as I got older, I realized Dad's lesson wasn't meant to empower me. It was meant to keep me in my place. Because in our family, Dustin was the golden child. 3 years younger than me, he could do no wrong. When he flunked classes, Dad paid for tutors. When he wrecked his first car, Mom defended him, saying, "He's just figuring things out." Meanwhile, I got scolded for working too many hours at my part-time job in high school, because it meant I wasn't home to cook dinner. By the time I was 18, I knew I had to carve my own path. I put myself through college with scholarships and late-night shifts waiting tables, earning a degree in business and real estate. I was proud when I landed my first listing, a tiny bungalow near Little Havana, but my family barely acknowledged it. "That's nice, mija," Mom said, without looking up from her phone. Dustin, on the other hand, bragged about some unpaid internship at a startup, and suddenly they were showering him with praise. Still, I loved that house on Coral Way. It had its cracks, literally, from years of humidity, but to me, it was proof of everything we had survived. I thought one day, when my parents were older, they'd pass it down to me, knowing how much it meant. Instead, I learned the hard way that sentiment doesn't outweigh greed. It started subtly. Dad would ask me about the market value of the neighborhood. "How much do you think we could get for the house, Alice?" He'd say casually while sipping his Café Cubano. I thought it was just curiosity. I told him the truth. Values were climbing, and holding on to property could mean an even bigger return later. He nodded, but his eyes flicked toward Dustin. Soon after, Dustin moved back home, claiming he needed a reset after yet another failed venture. Suddenly, my parents began talking about the house as his fresh start. I'd hear them at dinner, saying things like, "Dustin deserves stability," or "He'll take care of us in our old age." When I reminded them I was the one actually paying their bills at the time, covering Mom's medical expenses after her surgery, helping Dad refinance his truck, they brushed me off. "You're single and independent, Alice," Mom said. "Dustin needs more support." The betrayal solidified the day I found out the deed had been changed. Without telling me, they had added Dustin's name and removed mine, even though I had been helping pay the mortgage for years. When I confronted Dad, he didn't flinch. "It's family business," he said flatly. "You'll understand one day." Mom avoided my eyes, fiddling with her rosary beads. Dustin smirked, his arm draped lazily across the couch. I wanted to believe it was some misunderstanding, that once I explained how unfair it was, they'd see reason. Instead, they doubled down. "You have your career, Alice," Mom insisted. You'll buy another house someday. This one is better in Dustin's hands. I worked harder than ever after that, closing deals across Miami, rising to the top of my firm. Yet every time I drove past Coral Way, I felt the sting of betrayal all over again. The bougainvillea out front, the cracked tile I used to trip over as a kid, even the squeaky screen door. They weren't just memories. They were pieces of me, stolen under the guise of family loyalty. The final straw came when I discovered they weren't just keeping the house. They were selling it. And worse, they expected me to handle the deal. You're the expert, Dad said, sliding the papers toward me at Sunday dinner. You'll get us the best price. My fork froze midair. The audacity was stunning. They wanted me to sell the very house they had stolen from me, as if I were nothing more than their employee. I should have walked away then. But part of me wanted to prove something. To them, to myself. So I agreed. I poured my knowledge into staging, marketing, and negotiating, and in the end, we got an offer above asking. At the closing table, though, watching Dustin pocket the symbolic keys while my parents patted his back, I felt hollow. That day, as the sun set over Miami's skyline, I swore silently to myself. They might have taken the house, but one day, I would take back far more. The days after that terrible confrontation blurred into one long nightmare. I remember sitting on the edge of my childhood bed, staring at the peeling paint on the walls I had once covered with posters and dreams. Now the house felt foreign, as though every creak in the floorboards whispered betrayal. My Uncle Frank's words replayed in my mind. It's for the best, Alice. You'll understand one day. But I didn't understand. I was 25, with a steady job at the public library and modest savings, yet suddenly, I was being shoved out of the only safe place I had ever known. I couldn't stop thinking about the papers he'd waved in my face. Legal documents, notarized and signed, supposedly granting him ownership of my family home after my parents passed. It made no sense. My parents had always told me that the house would be mine. It wasn't much, a small, weathered property on the south side of Chicago, but it was more than wood and brick. It was memories of birthday cakes in the kitchen, laughter echoing through the narrow hallway, and quiet nights sitting by the window with my mother as she read me stories. How could he take that from me with a smirk? When I tried confronting my cousins, they averted their eyes. They were complicit, but too cowardly to admit it. Uncle Frank says you can't manage the house alone, one cousin muttered, almost apologetically, as she avoided looking at me. He says it's better for the family if he takes care of things. I wanted to scream. I had been taking care of things. After Mom's illness and Dad's sudden stroke, I'd juggled hospital visits, bills, and the upkeep of the house all by myself. Where were they then? Nowhere. And yet, here they were, circling like vultures when there was something to gain. I felt powerless. The law was complicated, and I didn't have the resources to fight him. My meager savings barely covered rent for a small studio apartment, and the humiliation of packing my things while my uncle strutted around the house like a king burned into me. He even told me I could visit any time, as if that would ease the sting of being exiled from my own home. Leaving that night was the hardest thing I had ever done. The house was dimly lit. The familiar smell of my mother's lavender air freshener faint in the air. I dragged my suitcase across the wooden floor, every step heavier than the last. I paused at the doorway, my hand brushing the frame where my father had once marked my height as I grew. The pencil lines were still there, faint but unbroken. I whispered goodbye, my throat tight with tears, and stepped out into the cold Chicago night. I moved into a rundown apartment on the west side, where the pipes rattled and the heat barely worked. It wasn't home. I cried myself to sleep most nights, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. My friends tried to comfort me, but what could they say? None of them knew what it was like to be robbed of both parents and the roof over your head in such quick succession. Still, something inside me refused to give up completely. Rage has a way of keeping you warm when everything else is cold. I told myself that one day, somehow, I would take back what was mine. For the time being, though, I needed to survive. I worked double shifts at the library, shelving books until my hands ached. In the evenings, I picked up tutoring gigs, helping neighborhood kids with their reading. It wasn't glamorous, but slowly, I began to build a fragile sense of independence. I saved every dollar I could, cutting corners and living simply. I learned to cook cheap meals, patched up my old clothes, and rode the bus instead of paying for cabs. Years slipped by in this routine. My bitterness hardened into resolve. I watched from a distance as Uncle Frank flaunted the house as his own. Family gatherings were held there without me, as if I had been erased from the bloodline. Once I passed by the house just to see it. The windows were brighter, curtains replaced, the garden trimmed neatly. But it didn't look like home anymore. It looked like a stranger wearing my parents' clothes. One afternoon, I overheard two neighbors talking outside the library. "Frank's lucky," one said. "That house has tripled in value since the market turned. Bet he's sitting on a gold mine." My stomach twisted. Not only had he stolen the house, but he was profiting from it while I scraped by, barely making rent. That was the day my quiet determination shifted into something sharper. I began researching. At night, I pored over property laws, inheritance rights, and old paperwork I had managed to keep. I reached out to legal aid clinics, hoping someone would help me understand if there was a way to fight. Most told me it was too late, that without immediate action back then, my chances were slim. But one kind lawyer, Ms. Green, listened carefully. She didn't promise miracles, but she did say something that stuck with me. Paper trails never lie. If something shady happened, there's always a chance to uncover it. From then on, my evenings became an investigation. I tracked down old neighbors who remembered my parents. I scoured records at the courthouse, looking for discrepancies in the deeds. The more I dug, the more determined I became. If Frank thought I had forgotten, he was wrong. Every sacrifice I made, every night I spent hunched over files and records, was fuel for the fire. And then, one rainy evening, while flipping through a stack of photocopied documents, I found something strange. A date that didn't add up. A signature that looked slightly different. My pulse quickened. Could it be? That night, as the rain hammered against my apartment windows, I realized this wasn't just about reclaiming a house anymore. This was about reclaiming myself. Frank had underestimated me. He thought I was weak, naive, someone he could push aside without consequence. But he had awakened something in me that would not rest until justice was served. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. Small, fragile, but alive, and I clung to it with everything I had. Because I wasn't just going to take my house back. I was going to make sure Frank regretted every single step he had taken to steal it from me. The night I spotted the strange signature, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my small kitchen table in my cramped apartment. Stacks of photocopies spread across the surface. The soft yellow glow of a crooked lamp illuminated the documents, casting long shadows across the floor. It was well past midnight, but my mind refused to rest. My uncle had claimed the deed was transferred to him legally, yet something about the paperwork screamed wrong. The inked scrawl at the bottom of the page didn't match my father's handwriting. I remembered his signature clearly, strong, looping, with a distinctive curl at the end of the D. This one looked jagged, shaky, as though someone had traced it too quickly. I pressed my fingers against the page, my pulse racing. "This isn't his," I whispered to myself, a lump forming in my throat. For years, my family had told me I was imagining things, that grief had clouded my judgment when I insisted something was off. But staring at that signature, I knew. My uncle had forged it. He hadn't just stolen the house, he had lied to everyone, convincing them it was his by right. I pushed my chair back and paced the room, the floor creaking beneath me. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with anger. For years I had lived in the shadow of his smug grin, hearing whispers of how Alice lost everything because she couldn't manage her life. Now I had proof that I was never the failure they painted me to be. But proof alone wasn't enough. I needed a way to bring it into the light. The next morning, I carried the documents to work in a worn folder tucked under my arm. The community center where I coached kids in fitness had a small office tucked behind the gym floor. Between classes, while the echo of bouncing basketballs and laughter filled the air, I spread the papers across the desk. I took photos of every page, backing them up on my phone and an old flash drive. I wasn't going to lose this evidence, not like I'd lost the house. At lunch, I sat with Marisol, a fellow coach who had become one of my closest friends. She noticed the furrow in my brow and nudged me with her elbow. "You look like you're about to explode," she said, unwrapping her sandwich. "What's going on?" I hesitated. For years I had kept this battle to myself. Sharing it made it real, and real meant risk. But I couldn't carry it alone anymore. "My uncle forged papers to steal my parents' house," I finally said. The words tasted bitter, but freeing. "I think I can prove it." Marisol's eyes widened. "Alice, are you serious?" I slid the photo across my phone for her to see. "Look at the signature. You've seen the notes my dad left me, right? You remember how his D always curled?" She leaned closer, studying the image. "This isn't even close." Relief washed over me. Someone else saw it. Someone else believed me. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I can't let him get away with it. I don't have the money for lawyers." Marisol chewed her lip, then leaned back. "You don't need to have it all figured out yet. Start small. Document everything. Maybe talk to a legal aid office. There's got to be someone who'll take your case if you have proof." Her encouragement steadied me. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't drowning alone. That night, I sat in my apartment again, this time with a notebook. I listed every memory tied to the house. The summer afternoons when my mom planted flowers by the porch. The winters when my dad shoveled the driveway while humming old ranchera songs. I wrote down every detail I remembered about the day my uncle had claimed ownership. Every odd glance. Every rushed word. I was building not just a legal case, but an emotional record. Something no forged paper could erase, but doubt lingered. What if no one listened? What if I lost again? The answer came unexpectedly a week later. I was packing up after class when a young attorney came to pick up his niece from the gym. I had seen him before. Crisp suit, neatly trimmed beard, always polite. He introduced himself as Joel. As we chatted, Marisol, never one to keep a secret, blurted out, "Alice found proof her uncle stole her house." I froze, glaring at her, but Joel raised his eyebrows with genuine concern. "Is that true?" I sighed. "Yes, but I don't have money for a lawyer, so it doesn't matter." He tilted his head. "I work for a firm, but I also take pro bono cases. If you really have evidence, I'd like to see it." My heart pounded. Was this a lifeline or another disappointment waiting to happen? Still, I pulled out my folder. He scanned the documents, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. "This signature is sloppy," he murmured. "If your father's medical records show he had no tremors or illness affecting his handwriting, this could be strong evidence of forgery." My chest tightened. "So I'm not crazy?" Joel shook his head firmly. "No, Alice, you're not crazy. You've been wronged." Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back. For so long, I had been painted as unstable, bitter, obsessed. To hear validation from a professional, it was like breathing again after being underwater. He slid the folder back to me. "Gather every piece of evidence you can. Letters from your dad, old contracts, anything with his signature. If you want, I'll help you build the case. But you need to be prepared. Family cases get ugly. Ugly." The word echoed in my mind as I walked home that night. My uncle wasn't going to roll over and admit his crime. He would fight, lie, maybe even smear me again. But now I had a path forward. I paused outside my apartment, staring up at the dark sky. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of something stronger than grief. It was resolve. My uncle had stolen my home in the shadows. Now, I was ready to drag his lies into the light. The following weeks blurred into a frenzy of collecting evidence. Every evening after work, I came home to my small apartment, spread boxes across the floor, and pored over documents I had saved years ago. Some were old bills in my father's handwriting, others were birthday cards, letters, and property tax statements. The more I compared, the clearer it became. The deed that had forced me out of my family home was not signed by him. I could almost hear my father's voice as I ran my finger across the steady, neat strokes of his name on the old papers. His penmanship was distinctive, measured, careful, almost graceful. The deed's signature, by contrast, was rushed, clumsy, and jagged. Someone had tried to copy it, but to anyone who truly knew my father, it was obvious. I photographed every piece of evidence, created folders, uploaded everything to cloud storage, and backed it up on 2 flash drives. I wouldn't let them take this away from me again. Not by denial, not by lies, not by saying I imagined it. One Thursday evening, Joel called. "Alice," he said, his tone steady but tinged with excitement. "I've been reviewing the paperwork you sent. You were right. The deed looks falsified. And I think I know how your uncle pulled it off. He bribed someone at the county office." My chest tightened. "Are you sure?" "Not only am I sure," he replied. "I have a contact who confirmed your uncle visited the office repeatedly around that time, and I've already spoken to a handwriting expert who is willing to testify." I closed my eyes, clutching the phone so tightly my hand ached. "So we have a case?" "Yes, it's not going to be easy, but we have a path. The first step is filing for a formal review of the deed." I almost laughed from relief. "Thank you, Joel. Really." He paused. "This is just the beginning. Your uncle won't go down without a fight. You need to prepare yourself for what's coming." His warning echoed in my mind long after the call ended. The first strike was small, but powerful. A week later, Joel and I stood inside the county courthouse, the air heavy with old paper and faint disinfectant. We submitted the motion challenging the deed, attaching our evidence. I remember watching the clerk stamp the papers, the loud thud of the seal filling me with a sense of finality. It was official. I was fighting back. But news traveled fast in my family. That very evening, my phone rang. It was my cousin Teresa, her voice dripping with disdain. "What are you doing, Alice? Do you know how much you're humiliating this family? Dragging Uncle Frank's name through the mud, your own father's brother." I bit back the heat rising in my chest. "Teresa, he stole from me. That house was supposed to be mine after Dad passed." "You know it," she scoffed. "All I know is Uncle Frank took care of things when you couldn't. You should be grateful." Grateful. The word slammed into me like a punch. I wanted to scream, but instead I steadied my voice. "Tell him I'm not scared anymore. He's going to answer for what he did." She muttered something under her breath before hanging up. But the call only steeled my resolve. If my family wanted to turn against me, so be it. I had the truth on my side. 2 days later, I encountered Frank himself. It was outside the grocery store on a chilly Saturday morning. He spotted me near the parking lot and swaggered over, his expensive leather jacket gleaming under the weak sunlight. "Well, if it isn't little Alice," he sneered, his grin sharp as broken glass. "I hear you've been busy stirring trouble." My pulse spiked, but I forced myself to stand tall. "You mean I've been busy correcting your theft?" His smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "Careful, girl. Words like that can cost you. You think a few old papers and some lawyer make you strong? I've been running this family for years. No judge will take your side." I met his glare head on. "We'll see about that." For a moment, silence hung between us, thick and bitter. Then he leaned closer, his breath reeking of cigarettes. "You don't know the game you're playing, Alice. People who cross me regret it." "Funny," I said quietly. "That's exactly what you'll be saying when this is over." His nostrils flared, but before he could respond, I walked past him, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. That night, sleep evaded me. I replayed his words, his smirk, his threats. But beneath the fear, a new strength stirred. For the first time in years, I wasn't the helpless girl forced out of her home. I was a woman taking back what was hers. The battle had only just begun, but the first strike had landed. The courthouse had my motion. Joel had lined up witnesses, and Frank knew I wasn't going to back down anymore. I stared out my apartment window at the city lights, each one flickering like a promise in the distance. "This is for you, Dad," I whispered. "And for me, he's not going to win this time." The wind outside howled, rattling the glass, but inside me the storm was finally finding direction. For years I had been silent, swallowed by grief and betrayal. Now my voice was rising, and soon everyone, including Frank, would hear it. The weeks after filing the motion felt like balancing on the edge of a cliff. Every step I took forward seemed to echo louder, stirring whispers, stirring anger, stirring fear. Frank wasn't used to being challenged. He had built his reputation in the family by controlling conversations, bending facts, and intimidating anyone who dared to question him. But this time I wasn't alone. Joel was with me, and so was the truth. Still, the pressure mounted quickly. The first letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening. Slipped under my apartment door in a plain envelope, it bore no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in red ink. Drop it now. My stomach twisted as I held it under the dim kitchen light. The letters looked hastily written, the ink smeared as though the writer's hand had trembled. I snapped a photo and sent it to Joel. Minutes later, he called. "That's intimidation, Alice. We'll file it with the court." "Don't respond. Don't engage. But it's him, isn't it?" I asked quietly. Joel hesitated. "I'd bet money on it." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a folder with the rest of the evidence. Fear lingered in the pit of my stomach, but instead of paralyzing me, it fed my determination. If Frank thought a cowardly threat would scare me back into silence, he had forgotten who raised me. The next confrontation came face to face. It was at Sunday dinner at my mother's apartment. I had almost stopped attending those gatherings because of the tension, but Mom insisted. "Alice," she said softly over the phone that morning, "please come. I can't stand the family tearing apart like this." I went, though my instincts screamed against it. As soon as I walked in, conversations quieted. Aunts and uncles exchanged uneasy glances. My cousin Teresa sat stiffly in the corner, avoiding my eyes. And there, at the head of the table as if he owned the place, sat Frank. His smile widened when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Look who decided to join us," he announced, raising his glass of wine. "Our little rebel." Laughter rippled through a few relatives, but it was nervous, forced. I set my dish of roasted vegetables on the table and took a seat opposite him. My mother's eyes darted between us, her hands wringing in her lap. Dinner began awkwardly, filled with clinking silverware and half-hearted small talk. But it didn't take long for Frank to strike. "So, Alice," he said, his voice syrupy but sharp beneath the surface. "I hear you've been making quite the fuss downtown, challenging legal documents, stirring up drama. Tell me, where do you get the time for all this? Don't gym coaches usually work long hours?" A few relatives chuckled, though uneasily. I set down my fork and looked him straight in the eye. "I make time for what matters, like correcting lies and theft." The room fell silent. Frank's jaw tightened. "Big words, but let me remind you. You're going up against family. Blood. That house was never yours to begin with. You were too young, too irresponsible. I took responsibility when no one else could." "That's not what Dad thought," I replied, my voice low but steady. "He wanted me to have that house. You forged his name, Frank. And now everyone's going to see it." Gasps echoed around the table. My aunt dropped her spoon. My cousin shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Frank leaned back, his smile returning like a mask. "Forged? Such ugly accusations. Careful, Alice. Words like that could land you in trouble. Or in court," I shot back. The tension snapped like a rubber band. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Please, both of you, stop this. This is supposed to be family dinner." But it was too late. Lines had been drawn in the sand. I pushed back my chair, stood, and grabbed my coat. "Enjoy dinner," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "But know this, I'm not backing down. Not this time." I left before anyone could reply, my pulse thundering in my ears. The following day, Joel and I met at his office to prepare for the hearing scheduled 2 weeks away. His office was a small but tidy space, its shelves lined with thick law books and files stacked in neat piles. He laid out the plan. The handwriting expert would testify, the county employee who had tipped us off would submit a statement, and we would present the timeline showing Frank's suspicious visits to the courthouse. "Frank will try to drag your name through the mud," Joel warned. "He'll say you're unstable, irresponsible, unfit to manage property. We need to prepare you for that." I nodded. "Let him try. I've spent years rebuilding my life. He can't take that from me." Joel smiled faintly. "That's the spirit." In the days leading up to the hearing, I threw myself into preparation. I rehearsed my testimony, memorized dates, and drilled myself on the sequence of events. At night, I practiced in front of the mirror, forcing myself to keep my tone steady, my gaze firm. But when the silence crept in after midnight, doubt whispered. What if the judge believed him? What if the expert's testimony wasn't strong enough? What if I failed again? Each time the doubts grew loud, I returned to my father's letters. Holding them, reading his words, seeing his handwriting. Those moments anchored me. This wasn't just about property. This was about honoring his trust in me. The day before the hearing, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't threatening. It was mocking. Inside was a glossy photo of my childhood home, Frank standing proudly in front of it with his arm around Teresa. Scrawled across the bottom in bold black marker were the words, "Already mine." I stared at the photo for a long time. My chest ached, my hands trembled, but then I felt something stronger rise inside me. Not for long, I whispered. I tucked the photo into my evidence folder, not as proof for the court, but as fuel for my fire. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. I dressed carefully, dark blazer, pressed slacks, hair tied back neatly. As I stood before the mirror, I hardly recognized myself. The timid girl who had once been shoved out of her own home was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to fight. When I arrived at the courthouse, Joel greeted me at the steps. "Ready?" he asked. I exhaled slowly, meeting his eyes. More than ever. Together we walked inside, past the echoing marble hallways and into the courtroom where Frank was already waiting. He turned as I entered, his smile sharp, confident, but I noticed the flicker of unease in his eyes. For the first time, I realized something important. He wasn't untouchable. This was just the beginning, but the battle lines had been drawn. And this time, I was ready to fight until the end. The courtroom felt colder than the November air outside. The pale walls, the stiff wooden benches, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, all of it pressed down on me like a weight. This was it. After months of waiting, after years of being pushed aside, today was my chance to speak. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Joel, my attorney. He was calm, flipping through his notes, his pen tapping lightly against the folder. In contrast, my palms were clammy, and I couldn't stop bouncing my knee. Across from us, Frank lounged at the defense table, his posture arrogant, his smirk infuriating. He wore a tailored suit, his tie knotted perfectly, as if he were attending a business meeting rather than a hearing about his own fraud. Teresa sat behind him, offering him small, nervous smiles. The bailiff called the courtroom to order. Everyone rose as the judge entered, a stern woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through pretenses. She took her seat and the hearing began. Joel stood first. "Your Honor, we are here today because my client, Alice Delgado, was unlawfully deprived of her legal inheritance. Evidence shows that the defendant, Frank Delgado, falsified documents to transfer ownership of her late father's house into his own name." I swallowed hard as he gestured toward the stack of files on the desk. My name, my father's legacy. It all felt so vulnerable under the harsh lights. Frank's attorney, a polished man in his 50s, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, these are baseless accusations. My client has always acted in the best interests of the family. The property was in disrepair, and Ms. Delgado was financially incapable of managing it. Mr. Delgado stepped in, made necessary improvements, and rightfully took ownership." His voice was smooth, persuasive, but the words made bile rise in my throat. Improvements? He had gutted my childhood home, turned it into a rental property for strangers. The judge's eyes flicked between the two sides. "Proceed with your first witness." Joel called the handwriting expert. A bespectacled man in a neat suit took the stand. He adjusted his glasses and spoke with precise confidence. "I was asked to examine two sets of documents. The original will signed by Mr. Delgado Sr. and the property transfer forms filed afterward. It is my professional opinion, with a margin of error so small it's negligible, that the signature on the transfer forms was not authored by the same individual. In other words, the signature was forged." A ripple moved through the courtroom. My heart pounded as I looked at Frank. His smirk faltered for the briefest moment before returning, though tighter now, more forced. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination. Isn't it true, sir, that signatures can vary naturally over time? People's handwriting changes as they age, does it not? The expert adjusted his glasses again. Minor variations, yes, but this is not minor. The slant, the pressure, the formation of the letters, these are hallmarks of forgery, not natural change. The judge nodded, making a note. I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. Next, Joel called the county clerk, the very employee who had first whispered the truth to us. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she swore the oath, but her voice grew steadier as she recounted the day Frank had come into her office. He seemed impatient, she said, glancing briefly at him. He pressured me to push the documents through quickly. When I noticed the notary stamp was irregular, I asked questions, but he brushed me off. Later, when I compared it to other stamps, I realized it wasn't authentic. Frank shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. His attorney objected, but the judge overruled. By the time the clerk stepped down, the cracks in Frank's armor were visible. The swagger was there, but beneath it, his eyes darted more often, his smirk wavered. Then came my turn. I walked to the witness stand, my legs stiff, my chest tight. The bailiff swore me in, and I sat, folding my hands in my lap to hide the tremor in them. Joel's voice was gentle. Alice, can you tell the court what this house means to you? My throat thickened, but I forced the words out. It's not just a house. It's where I grew up, where my father taught me how to ride a bike in the driveway, where we planted the rose bushes together in the backyard. Every corner has a memory. When he died, he made it clear he wanted me to have it, not just as property, but as a piece of our family. I paused, blinking back tears. Frank took that from me. He didn't ask. He didn't talk to me. He forged papers and stole it. And I've spent years living with that betrayal. The courtroom was silent. Even the air seemed to pause. Frank's attorney rose for cross-examination. His tone was colder now, calculated. Ms. Delgado, he began, isn't it true that at the time of your father's passing, you were financially unstable, working odd jobs, struggling to make ends meet? Yes, I admitted. But that doesn't mean I didn't deserve what my father left me. And isn't it also true, he pressed, that Frank took care of certain expenses after your father's death? Funeral costs, maintenance on the property? My stomach twisted. He did some things, yes, but that doesn't give him the right to steal. The attorney leaned in. Or perhaps your memory of your father's intentions isn't as clear as you think. I stiffened, anger flaring. I know what my father wanted. He told me directly, in his own words, and in his own handwriting. The forged documents don't change that. The judge raised a hand. That's enough. I've heard enough for today. We will reconvene tomorrow morning for closing arguments. The gavel struck, echoing through the room. As people shuffled out, Frank brushed past me. His voice was low, venomous. You think you've won something? You're nothing without me, Alice. Nothing. I froze, then turned, meeting his glare head-on. No, Frank. I'm nothing without Dad. But you're nothing without lies. His face darkened, and for the first time I saw it. The fear flickering in his eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every word, every glance in that courtroom. Tomorrow would decide everything. Would the judge see through Frank's lies? Would justice finally tilt in my favor? I didn't know. But I knew one thing. I wasn't backing down. No matter what happened next, I had drawn my line in the sand. And this time, Frank would pay the price for crossing it. The morning of the final hearing arrived gray and heavy, as if the sky itself understood the weight of what was coming. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blazer and black slacks that made me feel steady, armored. My reflection in the mirror looked composed, but the pulse in my throat betrayed me. Today wasn't just about property. It was about my name, my father's memory, and my dignity. When I stepped outside, the chill of the November air slapped my cheeks awake. I clutched my leather folder to my chest. Inside it, the letters my father had written me over the years. They weren't official evidence, but they reminded me why I was here. He believed in me. He wanted me to have the house. At the courthouse steps, Joel greeted me with his usual calm. "You ready?" he asked, offering a reassuring half-smile. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, forcing my voice not to shake. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Reporters had caught wind of the case, maybe because of Frank's reputation as a flashy businessman, or maybe because people loved a story about family betrayal. The judge's clerk shuffled papers at her desk, and the bailiff called us to order as the judge entered. We all stood. The sound of benches scraping against the floor filled the room. Then silence descended like a heavy curtain. "Let's proceed with closing arguments," the judge said. Her tone was clipped, professional, but her eyes gave nothing away. Joel rose first. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and stepped forward with measured confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about business strategy or financial necessity. It is about truth and about honoring a man's final wishes. The evidence has shown, without reasonable doubt, that the signature on the transfer documents was forged. An expert confirmed it. The clerk testified about the irregularities. And beyond the paperwork, we heard directly from Ms. Delgado about her father's intentions, reinforced by years of personal testimony and correspondence. Frank Delgado did not act out of generosity. He acted out of greed." Joel's voice grew firmer. "This house was never his to take. He stripped it from Alice through deception, betraying not just her, but the memory of their father. Today, Your Honor, we ask you to restore what rightfully belongs to her." He nodded respectfully and returned to his seat. My chest swelled with both pride and fear. Pride at Joel's clarity, fear at what would come next. Frank's attorney stood, buttoning his jacket smoothly. He spoke with a kind of oily confidence, pacing slowly as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client has been painted as some kind of villain, but let's not forget. After their father's death, Ms. Delgado was in no position to handle the responsibility of a crumbling property. She admitted it herself. She was financially unstable. Frank, on the other hand, had the means and the initiative to maintain the house. He paid for repairs, covered expenses, and prevented the property from falling into ruin. Yes, there are questions about signatures and stamps. But are we really to believe that a grieving son, in the chaos of loss, orchestrated a forgery? Or is it more plausible that discrepancies arose naturally in the process?" He paused dramatically, spreading his hands. "Your Honor, Frank acted as a dutiful family member, keeping the house afloat when no one else could. To punish him now for that is not justice. It is cruelty." He sat back down, confidence radiating. Frank smirked, leaning slightly toward him, as if Frankie was already sealed. The judge folded her hands, eyes narrowing slightly. For a long moment, the silence was suffocating. My breath caught as I waited, every second stretching like an eternity. Finally, she spoke. "I've listened carefully to both sides, and I've reviewed the evidence presented. While it's true that Ms. Delgado faced financial difficulties after her father's death, financial instability does not negate a rightful inheritance. The issue before this court is whether the property transfer was legitimate or fraudulent." Her voice sharpened. The handwriting expert was clear and credible. The clerk's testimony corroborated irregularities, and frankly, the defense has offered no convincing explanation for these discrepancies. The court finds that the transfer was fraudulent. My heart leapt, my breath rushing out in relief. "Therefore," the judge continued, "this court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Alice Delgado. The property in question will be returned to her effective immediately. Furthermore, damages in the amount of $150,000 are awarded for rental profits wrongfully obtained by the defendant during his period of unlawful ownership." Gasps rippled through the room. I clapped a hand over my mouth, tears springing to my eyes. It was real. It was happening. Frank's face went pale, the smirk wiped clean. He shot up from his chair. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cracking. "That house is mine. I put money into it." "She doesn't deserve—" The judge slammed her gavel. "Mr. Delgado, sit down. One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt." He froze, fists clenched, then slumped back into his chair, his face red with fury. As the courtroom emptied, people whispered, some glancing at me with admiration, others at Frank with thinly veiled judgment. Reporters scribbled furiously. Teresa looked mortified, her face pale as she hurried after him. I stayed seated, still trembling, still absorbing. Joel placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Alice," he said softly. "No," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. "We did it. Dad did it." Because in that moment I felt him. Not literally, but in memory, in the strength he had left me. Justice had been done. Outside the courthouse, the cold air hit me like a baptism. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, questions flying. "How do you feel? Will you move back into the house? What do you have to say to your uncle?" I raised a hand, steady despite the chaos. "I feel grateful. I feel like justice was finally served. And I want to say this. Greed might win for a while, but truth always catches up." Flashes popped around me, but for once I didn't shrink from them. I stood tall. Later, alone in my apartment, I sat with the folder of my father's letters open on my lap. I traced his handwriting with my finger, tears slipping down my cheeks. "You were right, Dad," I whispered. "You always said lies don't last forever. Today proved it." My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I opened it. It was from Teresa. "I'm sorry. For everything. I should have spoken up. I hope you can forgive me someday." I stared at the words, conflicted. Forgiveness wasn't something I was ready to give, but maybe one day. For now, I set the phone aside, because this Frankie wasn't about them. It was about reclaiming my voice, my home, my dignity. And as I turned off the lamp and climbed into bed, for the first time in years, I slept without fear or bitterness gnawing at me. I had won. And tomorrow, I would begin again. The morning after the verdict, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds, warm and golden. For the first time in years, the knot in my chest wasn't there. Instead, I felt light, strangely unfamiliar, almost guilty. Frankie had always been a distant dream, something I never fully believed I'd touch. And yet here I was, lying in bed, smiling without forcing it. I brewed coffee and carried it to my small balcony overlooking the Chicago streets. People hurried by, bundled in coats, unaware of the storm I'd just weathered. Life, I realized, didn't stop for anyone's battles. It simply went on, waiting for us to decide how to step back into it. But stepping back wasn't simple. The house was mine again. Yes, but the years of betrayal had left scars deeper than paperwork could fix. Still, I knew I had to face it. That afternoon, Joel drove me to the property, insisting he wanted to be there for support. "You sure you're ready?" he asked, parking in front of the gate. I stared at the building, its brick walls weathered but sturdy, the porch sagging slightly. My father's wind chimes still hung by the door, swaying gently in the breeze. My throat tightened. "I'm ready," I whispered, though my hands trembled as I unlocked the gate. The smell hit me first when we stepped inside. Musty, mixed with faint hints of stale cologne and dust. Furniture had been rearranged, photographs replaced. Where my father's portrait once hung, there was now a generic landscape painting. It felt wrong, like a stranger had dressed up in my father's clothes. I walked through slowly, each step echoing memories. The kitchen table where Dad and I used to eat pancakes on Sundays was scratched, but still there. The living room rug bore wine stains from one of Frank's parties, reminders of how he had desecrated this space. "This is yours again," Joel said softly, noticing the way my eyes roamed the walls. I nodded, but a heaviness pressed on my chest. "It doesn't feel like it yet." He placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "It will, piece by piece." That night I stayed there alone. I unrolled a sleeping bag in my old bedroom, surrounded by walls painted in faded lavender. Lying on the floor, I stared at the ceiling, remembering being 16 and telling Dad my dreams about moving to the city, about proving myself. Tears slipped silently down my temples. "I'm back, Dad," I whispered into the darkness. And I won. The next morning I set to work. I opened the windows, letting sunlight pour in, banishing the stale air. I scrubbed floors until my knees ached, dusted shelves, and removed every item Frank had brought in. It was exhausting, but each sweep of the broom felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When I tossed the landscape painting into the trash, it felt like ripping a mask off the house. Behind it, I found faint nail marks where Dad's picture had once hung. I smiled through tears, promising I'd hang him back up soon. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. By the third day, Mrs. Jenkins from across the street knocked on my door carrying a plate of cookies. "Welcome home, Alice," she said warmly, her eyes moist. "We all knew what your uncle did wasn't right. I'm glad the court finally saw the truth." Her words wrapped around me like a blanket. One by one, other neighbors came by, some offering help, others just words of support. It surprised me how much people had noticed, how much they cared. For years, I'd felt alone in this fight, but maybe I hadn't been as invisible as I thought. Rebuilding wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Teresa texted again, asking to meet. Against Joel's advice, I agreed, choosing a cafe nearby where we could talk in public. She arrived looking nervous, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She ordered tea but barely touched it. "Alice," she began, her voice shaky, "I owe you more than an apology. I should have spoken up years ago. I knew Frank forged those papers, but I kept quiet because—" Her eyes dropped. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing him. Afraid of breaking the family." I stared at her, anger and pity warring inside me. "And what about me? I was family too." Her eyes filled with tears. "I know I was selfish, and I don't expect forgiveness. I needed you to know the truth." Silence stretched between us, heavy but clarifying. Finally, I said, "I don't forgive you. Not yet. But I hear you." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "That's more than I deserve." As she left, I felt oddly lighter. Maybe forgiveness would come someday, but for now, acknowledgement was enough. Meanwhile, Frank spiraled. Reports came in that his business was failing, clients pulling away, creditors demanding payment. Word of his fraudulent behavior had spread farther than either of us expected. Joel called one evening, his tone almost apologetic. "You've heard about Frank?" "Yeah," I said quietly. "He's paying his price. Does it make you feel better?" I thought about it. It makes me feel justified. But better? No, revenge doesn't heal. It just evens the scales. And that was the truth. His downfall didn't erase the years of struggle I'd endured. Healing would have to come from rebuilding, not from his ruin. Weeks turned into months. I repainted the walls, replaced broken fixtures, and restored the garden Dad had once loved. Every project was a conversation with his memory, every repair a way of saying, "I'm carrying this forward for you." One evening, I invited the neighbors for a small gathering in the backyard. We strung fairy lights, grilled food, and shared laughter that had been absent for too long. As I watched children run across the grass, I realized the house was alive again. No longer a battlefield, but a home. Joel clinked his glass, drawing my attention. "To Alice," he toasted, smiling, "for proving that justice still exists, and that family doesn't always get the final word." Everyone raised their glasses, and for the first time in forever, I felt not just Frankious, but truly at peace. Later that night, as the last guests left, I stood on the porch, listening to the wind chimes. The same chimes that had sung during my childhood, the same ones that had greeted me after the verdict. I whispered into the night, "I'm okay now. Dad, we're okay." The breeze carried the sound of the chimes across the yard, gentle and steady, as though answering back. And I knew, deep in my bones, that I was finally picking up the pieces, one by one, until the whole picture was mine again. The day I faced Frank again wasn't in a courtroom, but on the street outside the courthouse. I had been finalizing paperwork with my lawyer when I saw him standing there, his shoulders slumped, his face hollow. For a second, I almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the confident man who once strutted around my father's house as if it were his kingdom. In his place stood someone weathered, broken by his own greed. He caught sight of me and stiffened. His lips curled, not in a smile, but in something bitter. "Alice," he muttered, as though the name itself burned. I paused, clutching the folder of documents that confirmed my ownership of the house. The papers felt heavy, not because of their weight, but because of what they represented, years of struggle condensed into ink and signatures. "Frank," I said, my voice steady, though my heart thudded. For a long moment, neither of us moved, Cars honked in the distance. Pedestrians passed by, oblivious to the storm brewing between us. Finally, he broke the silence. "You ruined me," I raised an eyebrow. "I ruined you? Or did your lies and forged documents ruin you?" His jaw tightened. "I did what I had to do. That house should have been mine. I was the one who looked after your father, not you." The words sliced deep, even though I knew they weren't true. "You looked after his wallet, Frank. You exploited his trust. Don't you dare stand here and rewrite history." His nostrils flared, but his eyes darted away, betraying his guilt. "You don't understand what it's like to be passed over, to watch someone else get everything while you get scraps. Don't I?" My voice rose. "I spent years working dead-end jobs, scraping by while you threw parties in the house my father left for me. I know what it feels like to be overlooked, Frank. But the difference is, I didn't destroy family to get ahead." For a moment, I thought he might lunge at me, the way his fists clenched at his sides. But instead, his shoulders sagged. He looked older than ever, his face lined not by age alone, but by regret. "You won," he muttered. "Isn't that enough?" I took a slow breath. Winning was never the point. Reclaiming what was mine was, and now I have it back. What you've lost, Frank, is the trust of everyone who once believed in you. That's something you'll never get back. His mouth opened, then closed. For once he had no rebuttal. I walked away, each step lighter, each breath freer. Later that week, I received a letter in the mail, an official notice that Frank's business had filed for bankruptcy. I stared at the paper, conflicted. Part of me felt a flicker of satisfaction, but another part, a deeper part, felt hollow. His ruin didn't restore the years I'd lost. It didn't bring my father back. Still, it was justice. And justice, however imperfect, was enough. The reckoning wasn't just with Frank. It was with myself. One evening, Joel and I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline. The house smelled of fresh paint and lemon cleaner, the scent of renewal. "You look lighter," he said, sipping his beer. "I feel lighter," I admitted, "but I also feel estranged. Like I've been carrying this fight for so long, I don't know who I am without it." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's normal. When you fight for survival, you forget what it's like to simply live. Now you get to find out again." His words stuck with me. For years, every decision, every sleepless night, had revolved around reclaiming my father's house. Now that I had it, I needed to figure out who Alice Delgado was beyond survival. 2 days later, I held a family meeting. Not everyone came. Teresa showed up, but others avoided the confrontation. We gathered in the living room, the air thick with tension. "I asked you here," I began, my voice steady, "because this isn't just about me and Frank. It's about the entire family. What he did wasn't just theft, it was betrayal, and the silence from the rest of you made it worse." Teresa looked down, guilt etched across her face. "Alice, I held up a hand. This isn't about apologies right now. It's about change. I won't let this family repeat the same cycle of greed and silence. If we're going to move forward, it has to be built on honesty." There were murmurs, shifting in seats. Some avoided my eyes, others nodded faintly. Teresa finally spoke, her voice trembling. "You're right. I should have said something years ago. I thought keeping quiet kept the peace. But all it did was let Frank destroy us." Her admission loosened something inside me. For the first time, I saw a path forward. Not perfect, not easy, but possible. But reckoning also meant confronting the house itself. One evening, I stood in my father's old study, now cleared of Frank's clutter. I ran my fingers across the desk, still bearing faint scratches from Dad's pen. Memories flooded back, late nights helping him sort through bills, his steady voice telling me, "One day, Alice, this will all be yours. Not because of inheritance, but because you'll know how to take care of it." Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't look away. This was the heart of the reckoning. Accepting that he was gone, that I couldn't change the past, but I could honor it by protecting what he left me. "I did it, Dad," I whispered. "I kept my promise." The final piece of reckoning came when I received a message from Frank himself. Just 3 words. "I'm sorry, Alice." I stared at it for a long time. Did I believe him? Not fully. Did I forgive him? Not yet. But the fact that he sent it meant something. A crack in his armor. A recognition of the truth he had spent years denying. I didn't reply. Some things didn't need answers. By the end of that week, I felt a shift inside me. The battle was over. The verdict delivered. But the true Frankie was in reclaiming not just the house, but my sense of self. I stood outside on the porch one evening, the city lights glowing in the distance. The air was cool, the wind gentle. The same wind chimes jingled softly, carrying memories and promises alike. This, I realized, was the reckoning. Not the destruction of Frank, but the restoration of me. The morning after Frank's message, I woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of my father's house. The beams cut across the hardwood floors, illuminating spaces that once held shadows of betrayal. Now they carried warmth. I stretched under the covers, realizing for the first time in years that my chest wasn't weighed down by bitterness. I padded into the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and leaned against the counter. The familiar hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet brought me peace. I wasn't just living in a house. I was finally home, but closure wasn't something that came overnight. It was a process, and I knew I had more steps to take before I could truly put this chapter of my life behind me. A week later, I invited Teresa back over. She arrived with a tray of homemade tamales, her eyes soft, but cautious. "I wasn't sure if you'd want me here again," she said, as I welcomed her inside. "You're my cousin," I replied gently. "What happened isn't undone by food or words, but I believe in rebuilding." We sat at the kitchen table, the tamales steaming between us. For a while, we ate in silence. Finally, Teresa spoke. "I should have defended you when Frank pushed you out. I knew what he was doing was wrong, but I let fear of conflict keep me quiet. That silence hurt you, and I can't take it back." Her voice cracked, tears glistening in her eyes. I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. "What matters now is that you're here," I said. "We can't rewrite the past, but we can choose how we move forward." For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of family that wasn't poisoned by greed. Not all bridges could be mended, though. Frank never showed up again. After his message, he disappeared from the city, leaving behind debt and burned relationships. Some relatives whispered about him moving south to work odd jobs. Others said he went broke and lived out of motels. I didn't chase the truth. Knowing he was no longer a threat was enough. His absence reminded me of something my father used to say. Some people teach us how to love. Others teach us how not to live. Frank had taught me the latter, and though his actions scarred me, they also shaped me into someone stronger. Meanwhile, the house blossomed into more than just walls and furniture. It became a sanctuary, not only for me but for others. I began hosting small gatherings, neighbors, friends, even a few estranged family members willing to start anew. The dining room, once filled with tension, now echoed with laughter. Children raced through the hallways, their footsteps a healing rhythm that replaced years of silence. One evening, as I watched Joel help set up a barbecue in the backyard, I realized I was building something far more valuable than property. I was building community. Feels different now, doesn't it? Joel said, handing me a plate of grilled vegetables. "It feels alive," I replied, like this house finally has its heart back. Closure also came in the form of honoring my father. I turned his old study into a library, filling it with books he once loved, and new ones I had collected over the years. I framed his favorite photograph, him standing by the porch, arm around me as a child, and placed it above the desk. Whenever I sat there, I felt his presence. On the 1-year anniversary of reclaiming the house, I lit a candle by his picture. "I hope I've made you proud," I whispered. The flame flickered gently, and though it was just wax and fire, I felt as though he was answering me. Still, healing wasn't linear. There were nights I woke with dreams of Frank yelling, of the day he shoved me out of the house, of my family's silence echoing louder than words. But now, I had tools. Therapy had taught me that scars aren't failures. They're proof of survival. Each nightmare reminded me not of my weakness, but of my resilience. When I shared this with Joel one night, he smiled softly. "You've turned pain into purpose. That's more powerful than revenge ever could be." He was right. I hadn't just reclaimed a house. I had reclaimed myself. Months passed, and life settled into something resembling peace. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun set, the Chicago skyline glowing orange and pink. Teresa joined me, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You know," she said, "people still talk about what happened. Some say you were too harsh, others say you didn't go far enough." I laughed quietly. "People will always talk. Let them, I know my truth. That's enough," she nodded, sipping her tea. "I think you saved this family more than you realize. If you hadn't stood up to Frank, he would have destroyed us all." Her words warmed me more than the tea. For so long, I had questioned whether I was selfish for fighting back. But now I understood. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was protecting generations to come. The final step in my closure came unexpectedly. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail from Noah, Frank's son. I hadn't seen him in years. He wrote that he wanted to understand what happened, that he no longer believed the lies his father told. "I want to know the truth from you," the letter read. "Because deep down, I think you're the only one who's ever been honest." Tears blurred my vision as I read. I didn't know if meeting Noah would be painful or healing, but I realized that part of closure meant being willing to face the future without fear. I wrote back, inviting him to visit. Maybe, just maybe, some pieces of family could still be salvaged. As I stood that evening in the doorway of my house, the wind carrying the scent of blooming lilacs from the garden, I felt a profound calm. I had endured betrayal, isolation, and years of loss, but I had also built strength, forged connections, and rediscovered love. This was closure. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of peace. I turned to the camera of my phone, recording my final message for the audience who had followed my story. And if my story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they too deserve respect and unconditional love. I paused, letting the weight of the words sink in, then added, "Because sometimes the greatest Frankie isn't in punishing those who wronged us. It's in proving that we can rise, rebuild and live better than they ever imagined." I pressed stop, the silence of the house wrapping around me like an embrace. For the first time in years, I was not just surviving. I was living,